To get the most out of EQ, there's a range of very effective techniques. When you learn them all, one at a time, with me, you'll have all the EQ strategies you need to succeed. Tight control. In part 1, we talked about the costs of EQ to the quality of your audio and how you can minimize artifacts by using broad and smooth EQ curves. If you didn't catch that one, go back and find it before returning to this. Now, there are some people out there who say you should only ever use broad and smooth EQ curves, but you should be wary of anyone telling you that their way of doing things is the right way or the correct way. We've got to be adaptive if we want to handle a variety of challenges and keep improving over time. So, broad and smooth isn't the only way to skin a cat. Anyway, listen to this ride cymbal for example, a classic dance music staple first heard on the Roland TR-909. I'm a big fan of this sound personally, but in its raw state it's probably too harsh for most modern music. If you were to look at this sound on a frequency analyzer, you'd see that it has a number of spikes in its frequency curve. The spikes cause the ride cymbal's high frequency resonant character, which is a big part of what we hear as harshness. By the way, if you think the ride sounds fine as it is, bear with me, you'll see what I mean. There's a lot you can do simply by finding a good level, tuning the pitch and tweaking the volume envelope to help it sit better in the mix. So it's sensible to try those things before turning to EQ. But if we take an EQ, we can pinpoint those frequency spikes either by using a frequency analyzer or by slowly sweeping with a deep narrow cut until they vanish. Now this is dangerous stuff. The tempting thing to do is to try to eliminate those spikes completely. The trouble is, if you remove those spikes, you'll lose the essence of the original sound. And if you're going to do that, you might as well use an entirely different sound source. Also, we should remember that using drastic narrow cuts has a cost to the fidelity of your audio. The more EQ bands you use, and the deeper and narrower they cut, the more you'll screw up the sound, especially its attack transient. To be fair, that's a subtle effect that, on its own, isn't enough to ruin your overall mix. However, when it comes to crafting a seriously good mix, there is such a thing as death by 1,000 cuts. If you make lots of little mistakes like that, you'll end up in mixdown hell, which is where the mix just sounds weird and wrong for no obvious reason and nothing you try seems to fix it. So, firstly, we want to make sure we're targeting those frequencies as accurately as possible. If you're going to be cutting only next to the target areas, then you'll need to cut deeper to affect the spiky bits, and you'll end up creating a hole next to each spike, which is counterproductive. Using a detailed frequency analyzer as a visual aid will help massively. Secondly, while we're using narrow cue widths, we don't want to be any more narrow than necessary. Use bands wide enough to affect each spike, but narrow enough to avoid affecting the surrounding frequencies. Judge this using your ears only. Thirdly, don't cut much. Whatever sound you're EQing has been chosen for a reason, and those spikes are a part of its essence. Just a gentle reduction of spikes can improve the tone of your whole mix. Speaking of which, it's vital to keep your perspective, so be sure to only set your EQ in the context of the mix, not in solo. And bypass your EQ regularly to check that it's a real improvement. Most of the time you'll find that you only really need to reduce one or a few of those spiky frequencies, not all of them. Just tackling the harshest of spikes is quicker, easier, and usually sounds better. As a basic rule of thumb, if you're spending a long time doing EQ for one sound, you're probably losing perspective and making your sound worse. So here's my EQ'd ride cymbal. Here's how it sounded originally. This method of EQ, while important to grasp, isn't suitable for sounds that have moving resonant spikes. So if you cut a spike with a static EQ, and then that spike moves, you've created a hole where that spike was, and you're no longer cutting that spike as it moves away. Sure, there's a number of advanced plugins out there that are supposed to deal with that kind of scenario, but I've yet to find one that works perfectly. My point is, you're not likely to need this kind of EQ on many sounds in your mix. For other challenges, we'll need alternative methods, hence
Way of the EQ Chameleon.
I'll see you next time.